Are you someone who bets half pot all the time just because you're not sure what else to do? It might seem like a safe option, but in reality, you could be leaving a ton of money on the table. In this video, we'll look at some spots where sizing up or down can make a big difference to your win rate, so that you too can be the shark on your table. When it comes to overbetting, the number one rule is to only do it when villain is capped. The last thing you want to do is to be bombing it into a range full of straights and flushes, because not only do we lose a huge pot against these hands, we also lose a lot of value against the hands that we beat. And that's because the more nut hands villain has, the more bluff catchers they can fold without overfolding. So the best spots to overbet are really those where our opponent has almost zero nut hands, because then it also means that he has to pay us off with a ton of weak bluff catchers. As for how we can identify if our opponent's range is capped, that really comes down to a combination of the action and the runout. So whenever our opponent takes a passive action like check calling or checking behind, it really makes it much less likely that he has a very strong hand, because all of his nut hands are going to want to be betting or raising to build the pot. So whenever our opponent fails to do that, then it's much more likely that he has some kind of weak bluff catcher that's just trying to get to showdown. And when you combine that with a blank runout, meaning nothing really changes on the next card, then that's the perfect situation to be overbetting and putting a ton of pressure on our opponent's bluff catchers. For example, on this king high board, button versus big blind, let's imagine if we make a small c-bet in position and big blind responds by just calling. So now we have the first criteria, which is our opponent taking a passive action. If he did have something like a two pair or set, then these hands would be raising most of the time, right? They're very strong, they want to be building a big pot. So the fact that our opponent didn't raise takes away a lot of these hands from his range. And you can see most of the calling range is really just weak bluff catchers, right? There's a lot of stuff like second pair, third pair, hands like weak top pairs that just want to get to showdown. And if we combine that with a blank turn, so on the deuce of clubs, for example, it's not a turn that really changes much. Big blind will, of course, hit some new strong hands like king deuce and pocket deuces, but these hands are really not that big of a part of our opponent's range. And even if we add them up with all of the previously slow played, hands like king 8 and 10-8, it still barely makes up 4% of the big blind's range. So now we have both pieces of the puzzle, passive action plus blank runout, and this actually makes it the perfect spot to be overbetting. You can see the only size that button uses here is the 1.3x pot overbet. So let's take a look at big blind's response in order to better understand why the overbet is so effective. Here you can see big blind is continuing all of his top pair. He's also calling with most of his second pair, and there's even a little bit of 8x and deuce x that's calling as well. And just from this response alone, you can already start to see we don't even need that strong of a hand to be overbetting. Even if we have a decent top pair like king queen or king jack, there's still plenty of worse hands that can be calling us, and we're also not that worried about running into a better hand. And this is actually a very common mistake, which is for players to go for a normal kind of size, right? With king queen, king jack, you'll see a lot of players just go for a half pot bet or a 2/3 pot size bet. And while that does get us called by more hands, the problem is that the times you do get called by these hands, you just win such a small pot. So overall, it's actually better to size up, right? And sort of accept the fact that we're going to get called by a tighter range, right? But at the same time, we just generate so much more value from the hands that do call. On the other hand, if the flush completes on the turn, then this is the spot where it makes a lot of sense to be sizing down. So if we try going for the overbet, with the same kind of idea in mind, maybe we want to win a bigger bet from hands like top pair at the expense of folding out a little bit more second pair, you can see the same kind of logic doesn't really work here, simply because big blind doesn't even have to defend with all of his top pair. And that's because he has an extra 9% of flushes to defend with. So all we're doing when we size up is just making the big blind's calling range really strong. And in spots like these, it becomes very important to go for a smaller size. So if we go for a 66% pot size bet instead, you can see that we get called by pretty much every single top pair, and even second pair and third pair are calling at a slightly higher frequency. So this is our strategy in a nutshell. You can see that on all of the turns that introduce new strong hands in our opponent's range, like straight and flush completing turns, we want to go for the smaller size in order to avoid making our opponent's range too strong. And on all of the turns that don't change anything, such as the deuce through the 5, we are able to go for the overbet simply because we're not that worried about running into a strong hand, and therefore we can just focus on extracting the maximum against the hands that do call. For our second example, we have an ace-high board, UTG open versus big blind call, and here you can see that the moment UTG checks behind, his range is relatively capped. It's not really checking back sets and two pairs at any significant frequency. So on most turns, big blind actually gets to go for a massive size. There's overbets up to 2.5 times the pot, and the reason is the same. It's just that we're not very worried about running into a better hand. In this case, the 5 might not look like a blank because it completes a bunch of straights and maybe even some two pairs. But the thing is that UTG isn't really going to be raising hands like 5-6 and 7-8 at full frequency. So these hands make up a really small part of his range, and for the most part, you can see his range is really saturated with bluff catchers like top pairs as well as under pairs. So even if we go for a really large size, UTG is still forced to call us with a lot of these hands. You can see that every single ace-x has to call at some frequency because he simply doesn't have anything better to be calling with. Looking at big blind's strategy on various turns, we see a very familiar trend where anytime the turn is a blank, big blind is just going for a massive size. So on any deuce, 3, 4, 5, 6, big blind is going to have a bunch of two pairs and sets and straights. And crucially, these are hands that UTG is lacking. So again, we have both pieces of the puzzle. UTG takes a passive action on the flop, turn doesn't really introduce any strong hands in his range, and these are really the kinds of situations where we want to be sizing up and getting the maximum amount of value from his bluff catchers. And on the other hand, if the flush completes on the turn, then now we have to be a little bit more careful. UTG is going to have a bunch of suited broadways and it's going to have a bigger proportion of strong hands. So if we want to value bet something like a set, then now it's important to go for a slightly smaller size in order to get called by more hands that we actually beat. Here's a question to test your understanding. Big blind checks twice on a board of ace-6, 4, 5. What size should UTG use when delay c-betting? Take your time to think about it, and you can resume the video when you have an answer. So it turns out that UTG actually wants to bet quite small here. And at first, this seems a little bit strange because big blind has checked not just once, but twice. So surely this is going to remove a lot of the strong hands from his range and allow UTG to be sizing up. But the thing is, when we're out of position specifically, checking doesn't actually have the effect of capping our range. And this is because we have the extra option of going for the check raise. So looking at big blind's very strongest hands, you can see they're all checking at some frequency because unlike when we're in position and closing the action, our opponent actually has the chance to put in a bet himself when we check. So we can always go a little bit more greedy, right? Check and hope that our opponent puts in a bet so that we can raise and build an even bigger pot. And because UTG has to worry about the threat of being check raised, this actually makes him want to go for a much smaller size. So the same formula still applies. We always want to look out for passive actions plus blank runout. But in this case, we just have to be a little bit more aware that checking is considered a passive action when we're in position, but is not necessarily one when we are out of position, right? Simply because out of position has the extra option of check raising his very strongest hands. So now that we know when to overbet, let's talk about when we might want to use a smaller size, like a third or a quarter of the pot. Typically, we want to bet small when we have lots of marginal hands that are interested in betting. And there can be many different reasons why it could be important to bet them, but the one that we see the most often is protection. For example, on most pair boards, the aggressor tends to go for quite a small c-bet. So for button versus big blind on a flop of 7-7-4, if you look at the composition of button's range, you can see that it's quite weighted towards marginal hands. Right? There's a lot of hands that have between 60 to 70% equity, and crucially, these hands have quite a bit of incentive to be betting. So just imagine if we have a hand like ace king or ace queen, and let's say we make a small bet of 33% pot. Look at all of the worst ace highs and king highs that we can get value from. And at the same time, we also fold out plenty of hands that have 6 outs against us. So with ace king, if you make a small bet and you fold out jack 10 and jack 9, that's actually a pretty good result because you're denying your opponent his 25% equity share. So whenever we have these two components, right, if we have some component of thin value and we have some component of equity denial, right, that's usually sufficient reason to be betting our hand. But of course, with ace king or ace queen, we don't really want to go that large. Just imagine if we were to go 75% pot. Right? Now, when you look at big blind's range, it's going to become much tighter. Right now, we're starting to lose value against all of these worse king highs or even ace high is starting to fold sometimes. And while we still deny a fair bit of equity, it's no longer enough to justify betting. And basically, if you want to bet a hand like ace king, or if you want to bet a hand like 4x, you're just forced to use a small size. And that's really what's driving this 33% bet size that we see here. On the other hand, if our range lacks marginal hands, or perhaps the marginal hands that we do have are not very interested in betting, then it wouldn't make sense to use a small size. So for example, imagine if we c-bet the same flop of 7-7-4, the big blind calls, and now we get an ace on the turn. Right? This is actually a spot where the solver mostly goes for the overbet. So looking at the equity buckets over here, you can actually see we are missing the bucket of 60 to 70% equity hands. And that's because in this kind of situation, if you have an ace or better, then you're going to have more than 70% equity. And on the other hand, if you don't have an ace, so let's say if we have kings, queens, and jacks, then these hands only have 50-something% equity. So this creates a situation where anything that it's not an ace, right? So kings, queens, and jacks, they're just not strong enough to be value betting. And anything ace, X or better, so if you have ace king or if you have a hand like trips, these hands are allowed to be going for a very big size, right? So there's not a lot of hands that make sense to be betting small. And while you can consider a hand like weak ace-X a marginal hand, right? So hands like ace-5, ace-6, if we did want to bet these hands, right, maybe we would see more small bets. But the problem is that even these hands don't gain that much from equity denial. So imagine if we make a small bet with a hand like a6. And now if you look at the hands that are folding, right, we just don't need to be folding out any of these hands. Right? They're pretty much drawing dead against us. So while we have quite decent equity when called, right, the lack of equity denial just makes it much better to be playing these hands as a check. And once again, if we're checking hands like ace-5 and ace-6, then there's really no reason to be using such a small size. Here's another question to think about. Big blind 3-bet versus cutoff on a flop of 7-7-4. What size should big blind c-bet? A, should we go for a 33% pot size bet? Or B, should we go for a 3/4 pot size bet? And don't forget to think about what our marginal hands want to be doing. So if you guessed B, then that is absolutely correct. It might seem a little bit strange to be betting so big on such a dry board, but at the end of the day, if we don't have any marginal hands that we're interested in betting, then there is simply no reason to be sizing down. So looking at the composition of big blind's range, you can actually see that big blind doesn't have any hands in the region of 60 to 70% equity. And that's because if you think about the kind of range that he's 3-betting, we're either 3-betting some kind of big overpair. We even have a bunch of 7-8 and 6-7 that has hit trips. And all of these hands are strong enough to go for a large size. So it's not like the previous example where it was button versus big blind in a single raise pot. Button's going to have hands like 4x, right? Hands like small pocket pairs that want to bet for protection. And big blind doesn't really have that many of these hands. And because of that, it really makes more sense to be using a slightly larger size that is consistent with how polarized our range is. Another key difference has to do with how much equity a hand like ace-king has. Previously, in the single raise pot, ace-king was quite clearly a marginal hand. We were able to make a small bet, get plenty of thin value, and deny a bunch of equity at the same time. Right? But here in the 3-bet pot, cutoff's range is much stronger after calling our 3-bet, and you can see this reflected in the equity of our hand as well. Ace-King only has 53% equity, so it's not really able to make the same kind of small bet and get called by that many worse hands. Most of the stuff that calls either beats us or has a lot of equity against us, and it's not like in the single raise pot where our opponent has a ton of ace-x offsuit that we can get plenty of thin value from. And as a result, Ace-King is really betting as a bluff on the flop. Instead of trying to go for a small bet, it makes a lot more sense to size up, hopefully fold out some pocket pairs, or if not on the flop, then on a later street. But at the end of the day, bluffs are really not that particular about bet sizing, right? They're really just there to make sure that our value hands get paid. And in this case, if our value region wants to go for a large size, then that's what Ace-King and all of our other bluffs are going to do as well. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, and you can also check out my channel, Poker Giraffe, for more strategy content.